Good morning. Oh, that's loud. So if you haven't seen it yet, in the back right-hand corner there we have some snacks and some coffee and other things to help get you up and running this morning, courtesy of Splunk. So please take a moment to stop by the Splunk booth in Expo Hall and say thank you to them for all of their support of SCaLE and really just all the sponsors that were able to make it out here this week with some of the challenges we've had. We'll go ahead and get started in just a few minutes. And if your friends are asking you, we do have the live streams running here shortly on the SCaLE YouTube channel. So apparently we have somebody watching from Sweden right now. They say thank you. Cool, we'll go ahead and get started this morning. I know there's still some folks milling in the back of the room. We'll just get the administrative stuff out of the way. So I think first things first, wanted to thank you all for coming out and making it to the 18th year of SCaLE. Know there's a lot going on in the world, but we were excited to celebrate this year because many of us were this age when we started this event 18 years ago. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But wanted to talk for just a moment just about what SCaLE means to me and sort of why we've all been doing this for the last 18 years, which is, and why it's so heartening to see so many of you here in the audience today is, really it came out of two things when we started SCaLE. The first was we wanted to meet many of our open source and sort of internet heroes, and I'm excited to have Dr. Vixie on stage here today. He's been involved with all kinds of open source software that I've been using since my start here and in open source and in my career as in operations and infrastructure. But the other was that we had a fairly distributed lug community here in the LA area. You could drive any night of the week and find a different lug in a different part of the LA area to get help with whatever open source or Linux issues you were having. And we were so distributed that often you didn't get to see all the different members of your community, and so we thought we'd start SCaLE. And so the way I talk about this event when I tell my employer I need to disappear for a week or two, or I tell my wife why I'm going to fly across the country for a couple days, is that it's a big party for 3,500 of my closest friends and family, and we're going to just have a big reunion together. And so as I look around the room and I see all of you here sort of braving some of the challenges we've had this week and sticking with us, like I said, it makes it all worth it putting this event on throughout the year. So thanks again for coming to do that. Over the years, I think I've met some of my closest friends at this event. And every year we look at the bar and we try to figure out when was the first SCaLE you were at, and there'll be a picture of me and somebody that was like, wow, I can't believe we've known each other for 15, 14, 18 years now. So with that, I did want to call up a good friend of mine, Phil Dibowitz, who wants to talk a little bit about some of the safety measures we've been taking this year. Again, talking about friendships, I think we met putting SCaLE on, again, 18 years ago. He's been in, he's been back, but these days he leads our diversity and safety teams. So thanks, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you. So obviously, it's an interesting year for anybody who's putting on an event in March of 2020. So I'm the person who keeps posting on the blog being like, hey guys, it's safe, you should come on down if you feel comfortable doing so. When all of this started, we started really tracking closely what CDC was saying, what WHO was saying, what local health authorities were saying. And we wanted to make sure that we were doing whatever was necessary to keep everyone safe. And so when we decided that we were going to continue forward with the event, we had two main priorities. Obviously, the first priority was to keep everyone safe. So you'll see all of the gallons and gallons of hand sanitizer that we've purchased through 900 vendors because it's a scarce commodity these days. But the second thing that we did was we really wanted to make sure that we knew a bunch of you guys were all going to show up, and we wanted to put on a good show for you the way we have for, or at least we like to think we have for 18 years. So what you will see over the next 2 days is maybe some of the schedules have changed. Well, obviously there was people who could not make it because their employers would not let them make it, or because they did not feel comfortable making it, or because planes got canceled, or various other things. And so we hope you'll bear with us. We've backfilled the vast majority of talks. I think we have a really, really great lineup this year, like we always do. And this was really important to us because, as Alon was saying, this is something that's meaningful to us. We are a volunteer organization. None of us are getting paid. We do this because of you guys, because we love what we do. So I wanted to say really quickly, for all of the speakers who decided that they weren't going to cancel their flights, that they were going to come on out, and that they were going to give you the show that you guys deserve, I want to thank them, and I hope you guys will join me in giving all of our speakers a huge round of applause. And if you go to the expo floor, you'll see that there's a bunch of exhibitors and sponsors who have come out with their swag and got on planes and did all the things. So can we also give a huge round of applause to all the exhibitors and sponsors who came and showed up. And as you walk around, you will see people in jerseys and people who have staff badges who showed up. And some of these people are local students. Some of these people have flown in from all over the country because they want to come and help out. And as someone who has been doing this for 18 years, I can tell you that there is no way you put on a show for 35+ people without a lot of volunteer effort, unless you have a lot of money. And as you may have noticed, our tickets are quite cheap. So can we also give a round of applause to all of our volunteers? And then lastly, please indulge me. I'd like you all to stand up for 1 second. Go on. Get the blood flowing. And take a moment and look around. This room's pretty packed, and that is amazing. So I would like you to all give a round of applause to yourselves for showing up. You guys are SCaLE. You really are, and this is why we do it. So with that said, please go ahead and wash your hands regularly. Use all of the hand sanitizer that we have provided. Do the elbow bumps or the fist bumps. Do not shake hands. I mean, you can do whatever you'd like, but I highly recommend that you not shake hands, and you guys try and stay safe. I think that we've done lots and lots of work here to make sure that this is going to be a safe and awesome and fun environment. And so with that, if you have any questions or concerns, you can find me. My name is Phil. I look like this. I'm around a lot, or any of our other staff or volunteers. And with that, I'll give it back to Alon. Thank you guys so much. Is there an Alon? Where'd Alon go? No? All right. Then I will throw out a few other administrivia things that I think Alon would have thrown out, and then I will introduce our keynote speaker. So make sure that you guys are looking at the app, because our schedule, as I said, has changed. We have game night tonight, which is going to be awesome. There is just a ton of events, so please make sure that you check them all out. And I think that's about all the administrivia that we have. Oh, Alon is here. Alon? No? That's it? All right, well, in that case, as Alon said, we do this to meet our heroes, and today's keynote is definitely one of them. I'm pretty sure most of you here know much of Paul Vixie's work, so I'm just going to, without further ado, say that please give the biggest round of applause to one of all of our heroes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for inviting me. I've been watching this developed from a distance. I don't really run Linux very much, but the cultural overlap between Berkeley Unix, which I do use, and Linux is just huge, and it's pretty much unified at this point. There are some details, but no longer do we sort of make fun of each other, and I like that. So I want to put this meeting in some historical context. You guys tend to prefer to build rather than buy. That's not in all cases, but having the source code to things makes you more comfortable. Sometimes you're modifying it to fix a bug for yourself. Sometimes you're playing with it to add a feature for others. But either way, you are a generation of technologists who've come in after source code was the thing. You would not have been happy buying binary operating systems and binary applications and using corporate network protocols. Instead, we've got the IETF, we've got TCP/IP, we've got DNS, we've got Linux, other flavors of Unix-like operating systems. And what that means is that we, the people who have to use this stuff or deploy it or monitor it or manage it, have had a gigantic hand in shaping what it is. And this was not foreseen. I'm sure it was a goal of people marching around in the 1960s in the civil rights movement that the people would have some hand in their future. But you are the evidence that it happened. So that makes this great for me. And I traveled a fair amount. At least one of you has seen the talk I'm about to give in Texas in November at the Nanog meeting. And I've been sort of harping and ranting on these issues now for upwards of a year. And my reason is there's some things going on here that are obvious and panicky for me, which don't seem nearly as obvious or panicky to others. And in a way, that means I'm here to set your hair on fire. But I'm also here to place you and this meeting in context. Who are those other guys? Who was it that we were afraid were going to give us binary operating systems, binary applications, proprietary hardware, proprietary protocols? Were we in a fight with them? Did we win? Is it over? So it's important to remember what Robert Heinlein wrote in the notebooks of Lazarus Long. No man is a villain in his own eyes. We have been in a fight, but the opposition does not think of themselves as an evil empire. But they have been making some recent progress, and it is coming to your doorstep as part of patches to various things that you're using. And I figure I better let you know what's happening, even though it isn't really the good versus evil thing that, say, the Star Wars movies would be about. So I'm coming from the DNS world. Started working on Bind in 1989 or so. I was an employee of Digital Equipment Corporation. They made VAXs. You may have heard of them. They were actually the second largest computer-related company in the world at that time after IBM. And that was where Berkeley Unix ran, so it made sense to go to work at that company. I ended up kind of inheriting the Bind code base because nobody else wanted to work on it. DNS at that time was not sexy. So I took Bind version 4 and rewrote it into Bind version 8, and then hired the people who did Bind version 9, which is now about 20 years old. And in that same time, I've contributed to about a dozen DNS-related RFCs to add things to the protocol. So I feel like I know pretty well what DNS is for and how it works and why it is the way it is. Others feel differently. So let's set the Wayback Machine for 1648. There were not as many named countries in what is now Europe as there are now, and there were a lot of wars trying to settle that matter. For example, they had to settle the 30 Years' War, and oh, by the way, if we're going to meet, we should also settle the 70 Years' War. And when you throw a peace conference at that scale, you have the problem of everybody and his cousin wanting to be there. So they had to come up with entrance criteria just to be allowed to attend the Peace of Westphalia. And that's the definition of nation that we have today, is the criteria that got you into that meeting room. And it simply means that if there are lines on a map inside of which you are the sole military power, you are responsible for ruling that area, and you are therefore responsible for anything the people there do, perhaps leaving that area and going somewhere else and doing something. And, you know, there are a lot of complicated words that go into this, but what they were trying to say is if you can defend it, then you can keep it. And so they had limited the representation in the peace talks to those people who had defensible plots of land that were defined in terms of lines on a map. So I really am talking about land, although sea was also involved. The reason for defining it that way is that as far as they knew, land and sea were the only domains in which force could be projected. So we talk about domains of operations or domains of warfare, and we say that land and sea were the first that were to be identified. So I think those of us in this room might want to be unfair. We might want to look back at those folks in 1648 and say, what were you thinking? Didn't you notice that you were breathing air and that there was something above the air? And couldn't you have come up with a definition of nation that would account for other domains of operations that would come in the centuries to follow? But I think that would be unfair. They had a lot to do, and considering what they had to work with, they did a pretty good job. In any case, when we added air, and it became possible to fly an airplane around, then those land borders didn't seem very important. Right? We had air a long time before we had anti-aircraft guns, and so this very much blurred the distinction of, are you the sole party able to project power within that region? Because now the region was vertical, 3 dimensions. And a couple of centuries later, we blurred that distinction further by putting a bunch of things in orbit, sometimes geosynchronous, sometimes polar, whatever it is. We've got all kinds of space junk, and they cross the boundaries of the land and sea domains without even thinking about it. And we'll probably remember the SARS epidemic, which was similar in some ways to the one we're going through now. We noted that birds don't stop at checkpoints to have their passports stamped. And so once you've got something that is airborne, it no longer really matters who was in charge of the ground that those birds were flying over. But in our time, we have added a very important domain of operations, both for commercial activities and military activities, and that is information. Richard Clark has written that information is the 5th domain, and I agree with him. People are still arguing about whether quantum will be the 6th domain, but we certainly know that the ability to project force today relevantly in any of the economies on Earth relies primarily on IT superiority, not on space superiority or air or sea or land. So this has a really strange side effect, which is the nations are obsolete, but they still have all of the land and sea capabilities they always had. And nations are now negotiating with other powers. I think you can all think of at least one corporation who has IT superiority over many nations. And that is a strange set of affairs. It used to be that having kinetic superiority meant that you were in charge. That's lost. It's already gone. We have studied the problem, but we have not begun to adapt. All right, so let's bring this back to the DNS. Traditionally, DNS relied on the stub resolver, which would be your laptops, smartphones, VPSs, whatever, things that make DNS questions. The recursive servers, which are generally operated as part of your access network. So if you do a DHCP transaction to get onto the Wi-Fi in this building, you're going to be given an address, a gateway, a netmask, and a couple of DNS servers. Now, you don't have to use those. There are a lot of DNS servers that are a lot further away from you than this building, and they have very sexy names like 8.8 and 9.9 and 1.1. OpenDNS, for some reason, did not get a easy to remember name, but they were actually first in this, and I'm going to mention that. So in many of our networks, we have an IP firewall, so that the only recursive name server that you can reach if you're accessing the internet from here is ours. Our recursive server is the only thing that's allowed to go upstream when somebody asks it for novel information, a so-called cache miss, and get something from the authority server. So the way you should read this is that the answers come in from the top, the questions come in from the bottom, they meet in the middle, and it is largely a matter of local policy where the middle is, or is allowed to be. So this worked, and the evidence that it worked is that we have scaled the internet by 9 orders of magnitude since this architecture was crafted. Nothing else has scaled 9 orders of magnitude, other than perhaps air pollution. So just before commercialization and privatization took hold in a great way, we had this as our internet system topology. And I probably shouldn't go through all the details here except to indicate where DNS fit in. Your users and applications might at that time have had only one computer to talk to. You might still have a mini computer, cost millions of dollars, and everybody might have had dumb terminals. Or you had Sun workstations or something like that. But in general, they would be on a LAN. That LAN might be part of a campus. Campus had connectivity through some kind of ISP, which then did the job of connecting all of its customers to the rest of the internet somehow. Now, all of this is still going on. This has not changed as radically as the DNS system architecture has done. But what I want you to consider is that the recursive DNS server started out as something that was either on the same server as you, because you had a dumb terminal and that was the only computer you had, or it was on your LAN, and eventually it might have moved to your campus, and eventually your ISP might have said, hey, if you want to use our recursive DNS server, you can. So we've been pushing that important function, that recursive DNS function, further and further from us. And so there might be a whole generation of people who don't remember running one, even though it is only 50,000 lines of code, whereas a internet browser is about 10 million lines of code. In other words, this is a very small function. There's no real reason to centralize it, but it got centralized anyway. So as an ode to George Lucas, let me tell you what episodes 1, 2, and 3 were about. See, the internet, if it were a territory, would have the DNS as its map. And so the transactions flowing through the DNS indicate to anyone who can observe them exactly what the structure of the internet is and what is popular right now. And it gives an opportunity to any on-path actor the opportunity to change it. Let's say you are an on-path ISP, you are in an authoritarian country where the government takes a huge interest in what these citizens are allowed to see. You might have it be that the ISP, because they are in your DNS resolution path, has the ability to just say, no, you can't witness anything about Taiwan from here. That would be an example of on-path filtering. So let me give you 3 times that the ability to be in the DNS resolution path was heavily monetized and leveraged. The first thing that happened, at least that made the newspapers, was VeriSign, they were running .com at the time, decided that they wanted to put a wild card at the apex of .com. And that meant, among other things, that you could no longer get a negative answer from them. If you had a typographic error or a configuration error and you were trying to fetch some content for which there was no actual DNS name, what you would get from VeriSign is a pointer to a web server that would like to give you ads. And those ads would be, of course, customized for the question you were asking. So you might get something closely related to the typographical error you made. There was a huge hue and cry, and we at Internet Systems Consortium put out a patch to bind, which simply required that .com always give you a delegation. It always gave you some NS records pointing at some other name server, and that if it gave you anything else, then bind would silently transform it into an NX domain. So this was the community, basically the people like us in this room, saying we don't like that, we consider that an act of war, and here's our counter move. And there were plenty of lawsuits. Somewhere I have a t-shirt that anoints me a certified Vericrime site finder co-conspirator. Eventually they settled the lawsuit and stopped doing this. But the fact that we answered this in the moment, right, that we had our patch in the field in 40 hours, and that it had an outcome, that it made a difference in the outcome, should not be lost on you. This community still has powers like that if you could agree on when and how to use them. The next thing that happened was OpenDNS decided that the recursive name server being in the ISP, although it was further away from the LAN and the server, it was not yet as far away as it could be. And they thought if they could put their recursive server at the far other end of the internet from you, that they could somehow add value. And I thought that was strange because it was already too far away from where the questions were entering the system. But then I immediately saw their motives, which is that they intercepted requests for www.google.com, gave you the address of their search page instead of Google's search page. You might think this would have been illegal, but it wasn't, and still isn't, because they did not masquerade as Google. They had an OpenDNS logo. They did not try to confuse you as to whose search page you were talking to. It also caused no loss to Google itself, because they didn't have a search engine. If you hit the I'm feeling lucky button, then what it would do is simply redirect you to Google's search index, but not having visited Google's search page to get there. So the answer you would get came from Google. So Google, of course, was not happy about this, but they didn't exactly have standing to complain, and what was being done was not illegal. So what Google did about it was to create 8888 and try to get that traffic back. So what Google didn't want is some competing advertiser getting the advantage of seeing what the query strings were and what end user IP they were associated with. And so they had 8888 on the street within 40 days of OpenDNS's actions, again showing that we live in a very malleable time, and controversy usually breeds almost instantaneous counteraction. Finally, after Google and OpenDNS and everyone else had put these Anycast DNS servers all over the internet, it turned out that it was no longer possible for Akamai to be able to judge what web mirror cluster you were closest to by looking at your DNS query. This was no longer coming from your recursive server, it was coming from Google's, which was probably on the same continent with you, but did not have to be on the same ISP or in the same metro area or whatever. So it was decided to take some of the end user IP information and actually put it into the cache miss traffic, so that when Google, for example, would get a query from you, it would staple your IP address to the query it then sent to Akamai, so that Akamai could tell Google where you should go. This was seen as a fantastic information leak and a terrible idea, but the website that announced it is still there, by the way. It's called afasterinternet.com. You can tell that they were fairly good at marketing. So this is the way the world now works. And I can tell you, since I run a root name server, that there's an awful lot of eDNS client subnets that are the full host IP address. So the idea that we are only going to send the top 16 bits or the top 24 bits didn't happen. But even if it had, this is a gigantic information leak. So that's the internet system topology as of today. You go as far as it is possible to get away from your users and applications in order to talk to an uncontracted recursive DNS server who then speaks to the CDN on your behalf and outs you at the same time. So this should tell you that attacking this DNS resolution path is a profitable endeavor, or might be, and that there are a lot of people who want to do it. I note that there are at least 200 other name or IP addresses that would be the same number repeated 4 times. That's probably the upper bound on how many anycast recursive DNS servers we will see in our lifetime. But it also meant that we were exposing our traffic to a lot more intermediate parties. And each one of them took their on-path advantage, and they either surveilled or modified the traffic in order to suit their political or commercial purposes. In other words, the on-path prerogative was usurped. And Snowden, when he went to Hong Kong, talked a lot about things the NSA did, and somewhere in that package of information they talked about DNS. And so when the IETF responded to the Snowden disclosures by saying, now we have to encrypt everything, it was decided that DNS clearly needed to be protected. It needed to be encrypted because it was very valuable, very fragile, highly informative, very leaky of personal identifiable information. Note that they did not say to take eDNS client subnet out. They just said encrypt everything. And that was done. There was some work inside the DNS working group to simply add another DNS protocol. It's TCP over port 853, and it starts out with a TLS negotiation. So it has the same crypto strength as HTTPS would have, just without any of the web layer present. And it's a decent protocol, and if we can make it TCP fast open work, we could actually begin to get away from UDP altogether, because the state costs are now manageable. However, the web team saw this and they said, well, that's all very good crypto and very good engineering, but it doesn't solve a very important problem, which is that it can still be blocked. You could still have a firewall that prevented any application from speaking DNS to any server that it might choose. And we think that you've missed the boat on that. And so they developed something called DNS over HTTPS. And they are using TCP port 443, which is the same thing that all other HTTPS traffic uses. And by so doing, they have made it impossible to simply have a firewall preventing any application from making a DNS query of any server they might choose. Now, this might sound like small beans. Here it is diagrammatically. We've added the things on the right. Various teams that I've been involved with have learned how to monitor what's going through a recursive name server, look at the telemetry, because you can learn an awful lot about who's infected with what by what DNS questions they emit. And you can also inject policy. If you want to lie about something, hey, it's your users, it's your customer, your family. If you're not a public ISP, then you probably own everything that is that's using your DNS server, and if you want it to not listen to things about Taiwan, you're probably, in the wrong historically, but that's your right. You could do that. More importantly, if you want to make sure that none of your conficker bots are able to reach today's mothership, which is a domain generation algorithm that changes, it's 50,000 names every day, but they're different every day. This is how you would do it. So that's what we did over on the right. What they did over on the left is say, we don't like any of your stuff, and we are here to tell you how DNS should work, and we're just going to have apps do their own DNS and speak to recursive servers that those apps will choose. And none of your firewalling is going to matter to us. You will not observe us. You will not filter us. So this is pretty hostile. There are problems. And the first is this is a political, not a technical project. They are not changing who can decrypt. They're not changing who can modify. That's already taken care of by the DNS over port 853 protocol, DOT. What they're changing is who can block. And that is a political change because it has to do with who has what right. And generally, when you try to solve a political problem using a technology change, you end up in a game of one-upmanship that eventually takes you and your adversary to a place that neither of you is going to enjoy. But it doesn't end. Remember, this is a long game. You get to make the next move, not the last move. Now, if you want to stay out of jail in an authoritarian regime, let's say looking up a name about .tw for Taiwan could get the police to visit your house, you had better use something a little stronger than DNS over HTTP, because the first thing you'll do after you make your encrypted DNS transaction is to try to contact the IP address you just learned. So any on-path actor who couldn't read your DNS is going to be able to guess what the address was based on what you do next. And anybody with any kind of data science background, if they know what the address was, they pretty much know what the question was too. Unless it's hosted at Cloudflare where there are 20 million names that all resolve to the same IP. But even that can be worked around. So really, you need a VPN if you're trying to stay out of jail. And anyone who tells the fiction of that somehow DNS over HTTP is going to make you safer against your political adversaries is going to get people killed. And I'm probably not going to shut up about that, especially when it starts to happen. It also means that whatever local naming you had, .home, .vixie, whatever, will not be available to those apps who decide that they're going to bypass your DNS infrastructure. And I have to say that the complaints about what didn't work are not going to be sent to the app maker, and they're not going to be sent to the operator of the Anycast recursive name server. They're going to come to the local sysadmin and they're going to scratch their head and say, I don't know why you can't reach the cafeteria's website anymore. Maybe we should format your hard drive and start over. You've been maybe infected with something. And then, I often click on some web thing only to have it launch a helper app like Skype or WebEx or Zoom. And if the app did their DNS one way, but the helper app has to use the operating system, they could get different answers, which again is going to create a lot of confusion. So the namespace has never been unified. There are almost always in the history of DNS, there have been local names that only work from inside the company. We do that by making sure all the apps and users talk to a recursive name server that has policy. So on the wire, I, as a parent wanting parental controls, or I, as a CISO, wanting corporate controls, possibly because I have some regulatory compliance issues that I can only enforce by looking at DNS traffic, and an authoritarian government who is trying to do widespread thought control, we all look the same to TCP dump. There is no evil bit. That means there wasn't a way to solve this problem for the political use case without having sort of collateral damage on the parental controls or corporate controls case. And so I feel in no way targeted. I know that the folks who are doing this are not villains in their own eyes, and they're not trying to make it impossible for me to filter the DNS experience that my apps receive. They just can't let others do so, and they figure that I will somehow adapt. Now, I would tolerate all of this if there was some benefit, but there isn't. This is not going to create any new privacy for anyone. And just as an aside, I have business partners in China. I go there half dozen times a year. I have always been treated very well. Even when I forgot to check into the hotel and my passport wasn't registered, there was no suspicion that I was a spy. But I have learned some things by being in China on and off for the last 15 years, and that is that it's one-party rule. The army is sworn to the party, not to the Constitution. And since 1949, when this system has been put in place, China has not been invaded. Whereas before that, somebody was invading China every 10 to 30 years for all of recorded history. That means that the people who live in China may not love the oppression, but they do love the peace. And the Chinese Communist Party has a great deal of money. Once we get done with this pandemic, they'll be back to being the world's manufacturer. That means that shipping containers of money are headed toward them by every country on Earth. There is not an amount of money that we can ask them to spend in order to preserve one-party rule that they could not, practically speaking, actually spend. It's not the case that if we just come up with complicated enough crypto that they will decide, this was a big mistake, let's be a free country. And that future is not in the offing. And so if you find yourself marching along, carrying a torch with a mob that has that goal, you should reconsider. We can certainly make everything more complicated, but we're not going to change that political system with an RFC. If you take a picture of no other slide, please take a picture of this one and read this article. I read it twice a year. It never gets old. This is the best explanation of why things are as bad as they are that I have read anywhere. C is good for two things, being beautiful and creating catastrophic 0 days in memory management. We all know this, and we all shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's the world, and we're in it, so suck it up. What this means, though, is that we're not headed towards some time that a self-driving car will not mistakenly see a piece of black tape as a transformation of a 35-mile-an-hour speed to an 85-mile-an-hour speed. We're not going to reach the point where we can put a rover on Mars without having to send a patch through interplanetary space at least once. Bugs will be with us forever, and we should plan for that future. I don't say embrace it necessarily, but a little bit like the pandemic, right? It's coming. You can't keep it out. What you might be able to do is control how much of it you have to deal with during any given week. And we're not doing that. We're making the assumption that someday software is going to be perfect. So I surf the internet, both the web and the rest of it, from behind a firewall. And what that means is that if you were one of my counterparties and it was kinetic space, I would be throwing rocks over a hill from beyond your horizon. And you would know that I was generally speaking behind that hill, but you would not know exactly where I was. And that's what it's like to surf the internet from behind a firewall. My connections can get out, other connections can't get in. I like it that way. And when the folks that are pushing DOH tell me that my firewall is outmoded and we shouldn't work that way anymore, you should protect all your endpoints, I'm wondering, let's say they're Google, does that mean they're allowed to buy an Amazon Fire Stick for some of their conference rooms? Or is it the case that they actually don't trust every endpoint? And in my position, why should I trust any of them? I keep things behind a firewall so that I can trust only that which I could potentially theoretically verify. And that's my policy. And I'm not ready to have a bunch of people who got excited about Edward Snowden's disclosures dictate to me a different policy. Now, this is only a small part of what's coming. I want to let you know that HTTP itself is moving to a very similar model. They're going to get out of the TCP business. They're going to go straight to UDP. They're going to encrypt everything. And the packets that they are going to send will not have any markers by which your firewall can determine that this is actually HTTP traffic. So if you're allowing UDP through your firewall, then that means that the next generation of web browsers will be completely dark to you. You will not know when a new connection is starting up, much less what questions they're asking. There's also something in TLS 1.3 where they can encrypt the SNI, so that if you have a working transparent firewall that intercepts HTTPS connections, even to the extent you can still do that, you will not know what host keyword they intended to present to the far end. So after you inspect the traffic, you will not be able to regenerate the connection and allow them to get what they were getting. This is pretty much a culture war against the idea that anybody other than the end user in the app should be able to know what's going on or change what's going on. It seems a bit naive to me, but they are quite serious about it. And as Lawrence Lessig famously said, code is law. We already have a situation where corporations are behaving the way nations used to behave. If those corporations don't like your ad blocker, it's very difficult for me to imagine how we're going to regulate them. So this seemed like a joke to me when I first saw it, so I took a screenshot in case it went away, but it didn't. This came from Mozilla Corporation, and they said, we have now identified a trusted recursive resolver, and in a few months we're going to change the default on our browsers so that your browser will no longer use your operating system to do its DNS. It will make its own decision, and it will choose a trusted recursive resolver, and it will begin speaking to that trusted recursive resolver for all of its DNS needs. And when people complained about this, they said, oh, don't worry, we're going to have a pop-up so that you know it happened. So I don't have a picture of the pop-up, but it comes about after the change has been made. And what it says is, we've just switched you to a secure DNS service. It's going to protect your privacy. Everything is going to be wonderful. Click here to acknowledge that we've done this. Click here if you want to go back to the horrible, terrible way things were before. So it's not as bad as that, but I want to just let you know that's how it comes across. But I wouldn't care how it was worded. My problem is that it's opt-out. If they want to give some misleading pop-up that says, we would like to do this, do you grant your uninformed permission? Then I would be concerned about the uninformed nature of that permission, but I would not say, you just changed my config and now you're giving me the option of changing it back. So I learned a new word from my children, yeet. I have yeeted all Mozilla Corporation software from my house and my business. I won't work with a company who uses this as their method of negotiating with me. So this is how things were before everybody had the ability to compete with nations for determining the fate of the world, which is that you had all these parties that were between an end user and the service they wanted to go to, and they all had to agree, or at least none of them could object, or it wasn't going to work, because any one of them had the ability to pull themselves out of alignment and withdraw their cooperation. For reasons of history, you still can't speak SNMP over the UDP port in the wide area, because a lot of those ISPs in the middle solved a problem we all had by withdrawing their alignment over SNMP. That was 22 years ago, and I think nobody knows why that's in their config anymore, so they can't change it. But in any case, this worked. This allowed you to put, let's say, an ad blocker or a malware detector as an endpoint security product, Windows Defender or Symantec or McAfee, whatever it is you're using. It was kind of there as part of the client operating system, and it got to see the DNS requests, among other things, in order to use behavior to determine whether something terrible is happening. They could also see your outbound connections, and you might have some plugins in your browser that block certain ads or block malware or block certain features of the JavaScript language. The browser itself, certainly in the case of Brave, has a lot of that kind of thing built into it. You don't even need plugins. It just does that out of the box. I love it. this was not good for business, and the web is all about business, and so this is where we're going next, which is that you can't withdraw your cooperation because you can't understand what's happening. You don't know which traffic is what. It's deliberately all smashed together. And it's not as good as Tor. Tor does a much better job smashing things together, but it will raise the floor for anybody who wants to have any policy. So not just the Great Firewall of China, but anybody doing parental controls. This is now their situation. I have to tell you that if you behave unilaterally toward someone, they're likely to behave unilaterally back toward you. In other words, none of us in this room is emotionally prepared to sit down and take it. What I've done is to watch the move and say, all right, what's my counter move? The game always has another round. So I've got some methods of detecting DNS over HTTP, which are highly destructive toward the websites that have that as one of many services, because I will just have to block the whole thing at the IP layer. And at the moment, there are people hoping that Cloudflare and other large web properties will put DOH on their main IPs. And one of them went so far as to say, so that people will think twice about blocking it. Well, they don't know me very well because I will not think twice about blocking it. So what we're going to have to do, if we liked the status quo as it was up to this point, is to make a huge investment in complexity in our own networks. I myself am switching to a different hypervisor that has firewall capabilities that I can program so that my VMs can all be contained even when I am at this podium rather than home behind that firewall. What you will do is clearly up to you, but you will be increasing complexity, and that will have a cost. And if you just assume that there is a fraction of things you understand out of the things you actually depend on, and you increase the bottom of that fraction without doing anything to the top of the fraction, you have just reduced your actual understanding level. And in the other great game, where we are trying to defend property, freedom, privacy, autonomy, whatever it is we're trying to defend, we might think of ourselves as part of the productive side of the economy, and we know that the unproductive side of the economy would like to live in luxury by taking our stuff and possibly selling our credit card number or emptying our bank account or whatever. So if you're in that defense business, the first term of the expression of your effectiveness will be the understanding gap. If you're trying to protect something that your attacker understands better than you do, that's a losing game, which means that any increase in Q has a long-term running impact on your ability to do any kind of defense. So you've now been required to either increase Q or lose your understanding in a different level, because TCP dump will tell you nothing. So those are expensive choices. They've been imposed on you. It's how I often feel in the ballot box, which is that I don't like any of these people, but which one do I dislike the least, and then I press that button. That's what we're being faced with here. So, running out of time, I want to say, when I get email like this, I recognize immediately that netbsd.org is not the personality by which I normally talk to eBay. And so this is a non sequitur, graphically displayed. And what I tend to do is look at the infrastructure that was used to send this mail, and look at the infrastructure that would be used if I clicked that Login Now button, and I poison all of it in my DNS server, so that no app and no user anywhere in my home or anywhere in my company will be at risk of touching any of the infrastructure that was required to put this on my screen. And that is something I have to do because of the number of unproductive criminals that want to come take my stuff. And if my browser decides doesn't want to live under my house's rules, well, I let each of my teenagers know as they reach that point that, there's a wide world out there and they can get a job and pay rent, or they can stay here and pick up their dishes. So I intend to keep living this way. Some of you might decide to do so also. So this is often misquoted. It's often quoted as every man's home is his castle, and in it he is king. This is what was actually said. But it is very much how I feel about my home network and my corporate network. And the fact that the king, if he was using DNS over HTTPS, would be able to come into my home tells me that that protocol is a danger to the underlying philosophy of the culture that I'm in. And I have been, as I said, ranting about this for about a year, and Mozilla carried through their threat. If you're using Firefox and your geo-IP is here in the US, your Firefox is no longer using your operating system's resolver. It's using either NextDNS or Cloudflare. And I don't care whether it's NextDNS or whether it's Cloudflare or whether they're US corporations, none of that matters to me. The fact that you didn't get a choice is the problem. In case you thought that this is as bad as it's going to get, let me assure you that the web industry does not like DNS because it adds delay. It renders a page, and as it's trying to render that page, it needs to pull up a bunch of usually advertisements, but graphics, JavaScript files, style files, etc. And there's a possibility that your ability to both witness an ad and click on it could be delayed by dozens of milliseconds while DNS sorts itself out. And these people can measure every one of those milliseconds, and it burns them like fire. So they're now going to include all the DNS you will need to fetch all of the ads in the web page itself as a meta header, so that they can reduce the most important metric in the web industry, which is time to next eyeball. They're not going to use DNSSEC, so poisoned DNS data that comes this way, I guess they're hoping that TLS, when they visit that site, will tell them that they have already swallowed some DNS poison. They're also not going to use the same origin policies, which means that if I want to give you a different IP address for Facebook.com while you're visiting FarsightSecurity.com, that's apparently okay. So this is what happens when you get a generation of people who are now designing protocols and designing distributed systems who have not been in the defense business. They never had to program a firewall. They never had to deal with cleaning up after an attack. And so pretty much anything that suits their purpose, which is reducing time to next eyeball and increasing ad revenue, seems good to them. But there are other forces in the world. I've mentioned what I will do, and I've tried to describe what the web industry is doing. But I ask you to consider your government, all the governments. They are not villains in their own eyes. They think that they have to keep doing what they've been doing in order to protect their economies. They are, in other words, patriots in their own eyes, and often in my eyes as well. And so, just as the Chinese Communist Party is not going to give up and say, I guess we should stop doing what we were doing as far as surveillance and control, so it is that your own government, anywhere else in the world, is not going to give up. What they're going to do is a cost-benefit analysis and figure out, all right, we have to be able to see what's going on because it might be a criminal act. How do we do that now that all of these doors have been closed to us? And my estimate is that they'll do this, and that we'll get a lot more poisoned hardware that responds to certain data patterns by opening itself to governments. And there's plenty of research indicating that this is easy. The supply chain for the commodity chips that are in our smartphones is pretty much wide open. Apple ultimately made their own fab in order to make sure that the chips going into the iPhone had only the transistors that Apple thought they were putting there. The rest of the world can't quite afford to do that. So look, I'm not asking everybody to consider the butterfly effect of every step they take throughout the day. There may be one, but nobody can sort of think about all possible implications of every decision they make. That's just not practical, and so I won't ask for it. What I will ask for is just think about the long game, figure out whether what you're doing is going to provoke a reaction that will eventually lead you to a place you like less, because it may be that the short-term advantage is a mistake in some cases. I don't see a lot of evidence that that thought process is going on. So this is a brutal thing. This is in the information domain, the fifth domain of operations. This is what Mad Max the Road Warrior would look like in the domains of land and sea. This is not the era of cooperation. This is not the era of trying to build something together that will be the rising tide that lifts all boats. We're being told that we can only keep what we can defend. So the Westphalian era is kind of over. A lot of folks think we are in a post-national period. If you think that, let me recommend to you a book, Rollerball. It was made into a movie that was the best movie James Caan ever made in 1974, but the book is even better. And that is a post-national future, and it's frighteningly realistic. We're not there yet, but we're definitely in a post-Westphalian future where the definition of nation is totally unknown at this point. They are the people who have the ability to arrest Mike Zuckerberg, but not the ability to regulate his company. That is not a world that any philosopher or politician has spent much time trying to write the rules for, and we're here. Thank you again for inviting me today.
So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today, and thank you for joining us today to share your knowledge. If you do have questions and answers, Phil, do you want to grab a mic from the back and see if, questions that Dr. Vixie can help answer? We'll take those in just a moment. Before we move into that, I just want to do a couple last-minute announcements, as I know many of you are running off. The first thing, again, is that tonight we do have game night in the exhibit hall behind me. I hope you all will join us. There is a ballot on each of your badges that you can turn in tonight to win prizes. You'll get to vote on your favorite exhibitors or other activities here at SCaLE. So please recognize those that were here. We do have a career day tomorrow. If you're looking for a job in the world of open source, drop by the career day. It's in another building on Sunday. And then, of course, we have capture the flag competitions going on as well. With that, Phil does now have a mic, so I can stop stalling. And if you have a question, raise your hand, and hopefully we will be able to help you with an answer.
Hi, Paul. You noted that DOH has this case where by seeing the subsequent requests, a bad actor government can discover your intent. Does DOT provide an alternative? It seems like a bad actor who can see a subsequent intent can already discover your intent.
You are correct. DOH and DOT both secure the information in the question and the answer, and I mean secures it both against surveillance or modification. So you get protection there. However, if you don't also protect the packets that come after it, then certain use cases for your adversary are still available. So, in my opinion, the reason you should use DOT is to prevent ISP monetization of your activities. Because if the ISP knows in general what IP addresses you visit, but they don't care to do the work of figuring out what domain names were there, you're probably a tiny bit safer. So I think encrypting this makes sense because we've seen so much on-path abuse, but it's not going to be strong enough to stop a committed adversary, such as a nation state. And if in that case your life is in danger if they win, then your life is in danger and you should know that.
I saw a question over here somewhere.
I have a more basic question. I mean, you obviously know a lot about this. I know very little about this, and every normal person in my life knows zero about this. So you're going to have some zero terms in your equation over there, which means the vast majority of people, which is in fact the vast majority of voters, in those countries where votes still are counted correctly, are not going to be able to defend themselves against this. So what is the future for people who have no way to defend what they have?
We are hoping in this room that everyone in the world knows somebody like us who they will say, hey, I'm worried about this article that says that Edge is leaking more information to Microsoft than Brave is leaking toward that vendor. Does that mean I should switch? We're hoping that just as I was the kid in the generation where I knew how to set the time on the VCR and my parents did not, so it is there are kids in the world today who know the answer to that question, and we're hoping that their parents are smart enough to ask. For the folks who just don't have access to that kind of free consulting, I think they are just going to lose autonomy, freedom, and safety until we can start to turn the tide. But I know that we're not going to do it by assuming that they are brainless and changing their defaults and changing who gets to see their personally identifiable information for them because we, the browser maker, know better than them. Whatever it is that's going to keep us out of that dark future, it is not more unilateralism.
My question is about what you're advocating for in terms of the social action elements. If you preside over a very large IT infrastructure and organization, are you suggesting that we start writing letters from the CEO and the VPs saying to corporations saying, if you do everything over HTTPS, we're simply going to block your domain from all of our corporate action? And can you expand on other what you see as the appropriate social response to defend against this threat?
So your suggestion is almost a good one, except that there's nobody you can really reach out to with that letter who will understand what you're saying. It's going to go into the media relations department of some large corporation, and it's going to go to the person who's in charge of ignoring you. What I suggest instead is that you just take that action. I block, at this point I'm blocking all n.n.n.n. I've got 250 odd firewall rules so that every IP address that looks like 8.8 but has a different number than 8 won't work. I've also been following various websites where a bunch of very proud young people are saying, I operate a small hosting company and I have arranged to speak DOH from every one of my 8,192 addresses. If they think they can get first mover advantage and that I'm not going to be willing to block them, then we have some learning to do together. But if you also do that as a large entity, that probably means more to them than me doing it. So the idea here is, we're in a game to see who has the leverage, because one of us is going to be the one pushing the rock in some direction, and then once it starts rolling, nobody has choices. But I would be more specific. Specifically about QUIC, the HTTP 3 transport protocol, uses UDP. And you have probably in your enterprise and in your home very few reasons to allow UDP today. I myself only allow it for certain video games that insist on working that way, but it's very narrow, and the default is that UDP is not allowed. And I recommend that you study that approach so that the various, especially your IoT devices, but also your apps like your web browsers, will not have the ability to just bypass your endpoint controls and your firewall and your filtering and your monitoring, because when they try to do that, the protocol they're trying to use will not get outside your network. So that's probably the most effective back pressure that we can put on the sort of the middle, the fence sitters who don't actually care about any of this. They just want to do whatever is reasonable and customary. We, in this room, have a chance to decide what is reasonable and customary.
So I've observed after refusing a share my location request from the browser that the website that I'm visiting nonetheless has a pretty good idea of where I am. Is that knowledge likely derived from a DNS leak?
So to the extent that there is a website and there are cookies and there are identities and there are UUIDs and so forth, then the equivalent of the DOH risks is already present. On the other hand, think about the Nest thermostat, which for a while was owned by Google. I don't know if they still own the Nest company, but it was not a thermostat you controlled from your smartphone. Actually, it looked like it was, but you and the thermostat were both speaking to the mothership over your DSL connection in order that you be able to see what the temperature is and set different thresholds and so on. And yeah, it was later found that the Nest thermostat had a microphone in it, and Google assured all of us that it had never been turned on, never been used. But I've seen enough of these IoT devices get rooted and broken into by malicious actors that the presence of that microphone really would bother me if I had allowed a Nest thermostat into my house in the first place. So I would say you may already have the problems that DOH is going to cause for you, but there are new actors who have yet to come in and who might not know how to get that advantage over you. And my recommendation is to fight every battle as though it could be the decisive battle, even though you know in your heart that there's always going to be another battle.
So I think, unfortunately, we're out of time. I know many of you guys have, many of you all have more questions, and you know, hopefully Paul will join us for a little bit longer and join you the one-on-one. But thank you again for joining us and sharing your knowledge and your experience. Thanks again to everybody that joined us this morning. Again, to Splunk for caffeinating and feeding us this morning, and to all of our sponsors, whether they were able to make it out here or not. They really helped make this event happen. So thank you.